How can I tell if something is being held in place and can't change position? And how can I tell if it's something that can't move any further because it's already there? AKA a door that can't close because it's already closed. Awesome question. So what Raj is asking about basically is how, from a mechanical standpoint, do movement restrictions happen? The issue he's running into is, for example, like let's say we bring my son into the mix and we're talking about hip flexion. If I have a limitation in hip flexion, how do I tell the difference between something that's a restriction of range of motion of stuff on the back side of the hip, so think like glute max or hip extenders, versus if I'm already in a hip flex position and I can't go any further because I'm hitting the end range position. So that's the two differences that Raj is talking about. And although initially, back in the day when I was kind of learning this stuff, I was under the impression that you could have a restriction by bumping into end range, bony blocks, things of that nature. But after learning a lot from Daddy O-Pop's Bill Hartman, who I'll link in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/muscle-contraction, that's not really what's going on. And also, too, if you look at some of the research, and I'll link this study in the show notes, that looks at bony contact or lack thereof when we're moving, the bones never touch. And that is likely due to hydrostatic pressure within the joint and potentially some other factors as well in terms of magnetic properties of water, among other things. Although the latter part, there's not a whole lot of evidence beyond basic sciences that support that. But we do know, at least based on one study that I've come across in the knee joint, that there is no contact of the bones. So then it's not necessarily that you're running into each other and problems ensue. The way things become restricted, as of our understanding right now, and this is the way I'm operating, is if I have a loss of hip flexion, for example, the only way I can have a loss of hip flexion is if there is a concentric bias of hip extenders that are limiting my range of motion. For example, let me get my grandson to illustrate this because my son's just too tall. When I have a concentric bias towards hip extension, we'll say, these muscles are going to be concentric, maybe shorter, and although I don't really like that term, but shorter. And when these muscles contract, there's increased synovial fluid presence on the front side of the joint. The reason why you then can't get into hip flexion is because of the relationship of those tissues not being able to slosh the synovial fluid in the opposite direction. It's like I have this large fluid presence in the front side of the joint, and the tissues on the front side cannot contract enough because they're eccentric to push the fluid on the posterior aspect of the joint. Problems ensue. Therefore, you have a restriction. That's the only way you can have a restriction, is if I have concentric bias on one side and an inability to overcome the fluid shift to create movement in the opposite direction. That's how movement becomes limited. What we have to consider, and this is where I think the issue is when we think of someone being concentric or eccentric, we think of this as an on-off switch. So for example, the example I always use is the elbow. If I have a concentric bias on the front side of the elbow, so my bicep is, pow, huge. It's not that I have maximal concentric contraction of the elbow flexors in the bicep. It's I have a bias. I have a slight bias in tension towards the elbow being in flexion. So it might only be like this amount of tension. But it might be enough tension that I would limit my ability to extend the elbow. If I had a situation where the door was completely closed, as Raj was talking about, or I have maximal concentric bias of the elbow flexors, pow! I would not have any ability to extend the elbow. And that's not what we're dealing with. right? That would be the one situation where I can't get any more flexion because I'm already there. But we never run into that unless we have someone who's got a severe contracture of some sort, or there's severe changes in the joint surfaces that would create an inability to get any range of motion anywhere. But that's very few and far between. What we're likely dealing with is biases, slight biases in tension in one direction versus the other. So if you have someone who can't get full hip flexion, that's because they have a slight, or depending on the degree of restriction, moderate bias concentrically of the hip extenders. And that's limiting the fluid dynamics that are needed to get into hip flexion. It cannot be you're already there unless you have maximal concentric bias of those tissues. But then you wouldn't have any range of motion going in the opposite direction. And that's just a different way of looking, or like a slight contention point that I've had in times past. But again, having looked at fluid dynamics and joint motions a bit differently, as well as reviewing some of the studies that show that your bones do not touch when you move, I think this is a much more accurate representation as to why motions become limited. To summarize your great question, Raj, the reason why a motion becomes limited has to be because there's concentric bias in one direction and a slight eccentric bias in the other. If we're talking about the elbow as an example, if I can't get full extension, the only way that I have a loss of elbow extension is because there's a slight or moderate concentric bias into elbow flexion that is increasing fluid presence on the posterior aspect of the joint, and that individual may have an inability to create that fluid shift in the opposite direction. Then, if you want to get that mo beta, your activities need to focus on creating that fluid shift, and if you do those things, you ought to be in business. Great question, Raj.